Okay. Welcome to this evening's discussion on celebrating women in history, our admin special. Our speakers this evening are myself, Sharon Bennett Connolly, Virginia Crowe, Paula Lofting, Cathie Dunn, Samantha Wilcoxson, and Lynn Dawson, who writes as Lynn Bryant. Got it the right way around, haven't I, Lynn? So apparently I lost the toss and I'm kicking off celebrating my favourite woman in history. If you just give me a second. Okay. Slideshow from current slide. So any of you who actually know me have probably guessed already who my favourite woman from history is, and I've done it again and put the pictures on the writing on the wrong side. So if I thought it was going to prompt me, I'm in trouble. So, but my favourite woman from history, hold on, just checking the time because I've got 5 minutes, and Cathie's going to be waving at me if I take too long, is Nicola de la Haye. Hereditary Castellan of Lincoln Castle in Lincolnshire, which is on your screen now. Nicola was a friend of King John, and she held Lincoln Castle against all comers. She held it during 3 sieges. In 1191, when her husband fell foul of the Justiciar left in charge by Richard I, he ordered that Gerard de Camville. Thank you, Paula. Turn your microphone off, please.
I'll turn me off.
He ordered that Gerard de Camville relinquish Lincoln Castle. Gerard was Nicola's husband. And Gerard appealed to Prince John for help, who was at Nottingham Castle at the time. So he rode off to see Prince John in person. In the meantime, leaving Nicola in charge of Lincoln Castle. In the meantime, Richard's Justiciar, William Longchamp, decided that he'd come himself and take the castle, probably thinking there was only a woman in charge, it would be easy pickings. After 40 days and 40 nights, he had to ride away because Nicola was not relinquishing, giving up the castle. And in the meantime, Prince John had taken Nottingham and Tickhill, so there was actually no point to Longchamp taking Lincoln anymore. The description of Nicola at the time was, I think it was Richard of Devizes, said that she defended the castle by not thinking of anything womanly. So, unfortunately for Nicola and Gerard, when Richard I came back, he decided to side with the Justiciar, and they were really relieved of their position at Lincoln Castle and had to go and live on Nicola's own estates for a little while. They did eventually manage to buy back all their lands that Richard had confiscated for, I think it was £2,000. But they didn't get Lincoln Castle back until 1199, when King John came to the throne, because John was a friend of Nicola and Gerard. So one of the first things he did was give Nicola and Gerard the castle back. And they stayed in command of the castle together for the next 15 years, doing some rebuilding, looking after Lincolnshire. Gerard was Sheriff of Lincolnshire for a few years and was justice in the area as well. Until 1215, poor Gerard dies at the beginning of 1215, January. But instead of replacing him, Nicola gets to keep her castle. And as we know, 1215 is also the year of Magna Carta. That was in June 1215. By the end of 1215, the rebel barons had invited the French over to England, asking Prince Louis to come and take the throne from John. Now, the problem with this was that in 1216, the rebel barons invested Lincoln Castle again, trying to take it from Nicola. She paid them off. But then Prince Louis sent reinforcements to Lincoln. When John died in October 1216, he sent up reinforcements to Lincoln because the barons decided to besiege the castle again. John wasn't there to stop them. And from October, the end of October, to May the following year, Nicola was permanently under siege. Now, she was running out of many supplies by the time that William Marshall ordered a muster of troops at Newark to come and relieve Lincoln. And he arrived outside Lincoln on the 20th of May, 1217, for the Second Battle of Lincoln that was called the Lincoln Fair. And the battle lasted for about 6 hours. This scene is brilliant because it's of the raiders, these longbowmen, managed to get into the castle through one of the postern gates and arrange themselves on the castle wall so that they could fire down on the French. Now, the French and the English rebels didn't actually know that the rescuers, that Marshall's army had got into the city yet. And one of the ones working the siege engines thought it was a friend of his who'd arrived to help them attack the castle, when this bloke turns round and swipes his head off with a sword. So the battle lasted for 6 hours. By the end of it, the French and rebel barons were defeated. The leader of the French, the Comte de Perche, had been killed in front of Lincoln Cathedral, and Nicola had managed to defend Lincoln Castle for about 6 months and had saved England, because what the Battle of Lincoln was it was Marshall's idea to get one big battle that would defeat the rebels and see the French off. And by the summer, this had happened, the battle was in May, by the summer the French had gone home. In a fabulous display of ingratitude, 4 days later, Nicola was relieved of the position of Sheriff of Lincolnshire, which he'd been given on King John's deathbed. And William Longspay, the Earl of Salisbury, seized the castle. Not being one to give up, Nicola marches herself down to the English court, to the king, and demands that she gets her castle back. She doesn't get the sheriffdom back, but she does get her castle back, and she spends the next 9 years defending it against Longspay, who kept trying to get the castle. And there's records of Fulk de Bréauté being sent with longbowmen to help her defend the castle, Longspay trying to offer hostages so that he could get the castle. But in 1226, he died in March, and Nicola was safe. Her castle was safe. So she retired. She wasn't going to retire until Longspay had kicked the bucket, but 3 months after he had, she retired. She was just making sure he wasn't getting her castle. Oh, that's the end of my display. Right, so Nicola saved England, defended the castle 3 times, is the first woman in England, which I forgot to mention in the talk, to be named Sheriff of Lincoln, to be named a sheriff. Thank you, and I will pass on to who wants to go next. Cathie?
Right, just unmuted myself. I don't have a nice fancy presentation, sadly. I don't know if it's possible to share an image.
Yeah, if you go to share screen, it should let you do that.
Yeah, I'll see if I can. Oh no, okay, I can't share. Never mind, it's fine. I don't have such a nice presentation, I'm afraid. I just have a very simple talk, and I just need to find it as well, which doesn't help. Okay. Unlike the very heroic Nicola, the lady that I am talking about is not quite such a heroine. I'm talking about the Marquise de Montespan, and whether she was a scheming bully or a lady of power in a man's world. As we're celebrating women in history, we must not forget that not all women were heroines, philanthropists, or fighters for justice. Some were in it for themselves, but in a world run by men, for men, how can a woman make it to the top? Tonight, I am talking not about a heroic lady or a caring one, but one who managed to ensnare one of the most illustrious men of the era, King Louis XIV of France. I'm talking about his long-term maîtresse en titre, his long-term mistress, Madame de Montespan. She was born as, nice French name, Françoise de Rochechouart de Mortemart on 5th October 1640 in the Poitou in Western France to a very noble family of ancient lineage. She was linked to various royals as well through her lines, so it was quite a powerful family. And by her early 20s, she had risen to the post of lady-in-waiting to the king's sister-in-law, the Duchess of Orleans, which was one Princess Henrietta Anne of England, who sadly didn't live for long there, but that's where our Françoise started. In January 1663, she married the Marquis de Montespan in an arranged marriage. She had her sights on another guy who sadly had to flee the country because he was caught dueling. So her family married her off to him. He was a year younger, and I believe he was quite prone to the games tables, which wasn't really allowed either in the days of Louis XIV, but he was trouble. But together with their son and their daughter, they lived near the Louvre, which at the time was the seat of government. That was before Versailles was extended and used as a palace. So the royal family and the court was at the Louvre. Educated at a convent, the young Françoise excelled in her knowledge of culture, music, and her interest in politics. And she was not too shy to voice her opinions. She was quite self-assured, the lady. Her beauty and her vibrant character appealed to courtiers, but by 1666, she had set her sights on the highest prize of all, the king. But Louis already had a long-term mistress, one Louise de la Vallière, who made the mistake early on to underestimate her ambitious rival. Françoise befriended Louise and the Queen, Maria Theresa of Spain, whom she actually despised quite openly. And when both ladies fell pregnant, Françoise was very happy to replace them in the king's bedchamber. Initially, Louis made both mistresses share adjoining apartments, which must have been quite something. I can just imagine, you know, door to door, right next door to your rival and seeing him arrive and leave. So it would have been quite a few jealousies there. So the arrangement did not please either of the women. And from what the sources are telling us, it's very, very clear that Françoise bullied Louise, who eventually retired to a convent. Fortunately for Louise, it turned out that she found much contentment there, and she was very happy playing kind of the nun in a quiet environment, rediscovering her faith and what she considered doing her penance for her life as the mistress of a married man. And in the meantime, Françoise, also known as La Montespan, began to extend her influence over Louis. She excelled in her social and organizational skills. She arranged plays, masked balls, theme nights, kind of mythical nights and all that kind of stuff, fireworks displays, and many other forms of public entertainment for the king's pleasure. And poor Queen Maria Theresa, meanwhile, rarely featured at these events, which saw our Françoise take the best spot beside the king. Of course, he outshone everyone, and then there was she. She started to style herself as a mythical Athénaïs, and she quickly became the star of the court, easily outshining even the queen, who was quite a quiet woman and who was, I would assume, quite browbeaten by her philandering husband. With her quick wit, her sense of humor, and excellent conversational skills, she added sparkle to any event, and the king was soon besotted. Soon she began to bear Louis children, and in the end they had 7 children in total, with 3 dying in childhood and 4 living to adulthood. The king legitimized all their surviving children, which is a rather unusual move. And they would later make very advantageous marriages, and some of them are forebears of future royalty across Europe. Françoise officially separated from her husband in 1674, tired of paying for his debts, but by 1675, the adulterous nature of her relationship with the married king became an issue for the church. And Louis, who was keen to remain in the church's good graces, not end up excommunicated, agreed to a separation from her, but that didn't last long. Throughout the time, her behavior towards other potential favorites of the king was that of a bully. She basically pushed everyone else aside, and she made their life miserable. She schemed their departure with precision and with the help of nefarious means, which eventually led to her downfall. Because dazzling the courtiers on one hand with her great entertainment, La Montespan hid her dark side well until her name cropped up in investigations during the so-called Affair of the Poisons. By the mid-1670s, a network of poisoners was busy at work in Paris, and suspicious revelations led to an investigation that crossed social hierarchies from the very poorest to the richest. There were people who were involved at all levels. And over the years, more than 400 individuals were arrested and interrogated as part of the investigations, which were then called the Burning Court, la Chambre Ardente. Usually under torture if they were unwilling to reveal their secrets. But when famous names appeared on the lists, especially that of Madame de Montespan, the court was suddenly kept behind closed doors and eventually dissolved. And when it was revealed that Françoise had apparently regularly sought out the service of La Voisin, the most famous witch of the trials, Louis had everything hushed up. Those who knew of her involvement were either executed or locked in solitary confinement, never to speak to anyone. But what had she done that was so serious that she incurred the king's wrath? It transpired, apparently, that since the mid-1660s, she had used potions to entice the king. These potions, mixed into his food, were said to have been collected from the blood and crushed bones of newborn children who'd been sacrificed during black masses, which were held in her presence by La Voisin. Louis, meanwhile, had no idea. So that's what she was accused of. In how far there is much truth to it or little truth still remains debatable, because everything was hushed up and documents were destroyed at his order. And by the early 1680s, around that same time, she had also voiced her displeasure with the king, who'd by then lost interest in her. She had grown overweight due to her love of food and following multiple pregnancies, and she was bitterly jealous of new love interests. And so it was rumored that she said she wanted to poison the king as punishment. And that was too much even for him, who banished her from court. And by then he'd grown more religious and he felt drawn to a Madame de Maintenon, who was the lady in charge of the children he had with Françoise. The irony isn't lost on us. So the aging king would enter into a morganatic marriage with her, it is said, after the queen's death, and not stray from her side. And as for La Montespan, she would never rise to power again. In 1691, she retired to a convent and lived out her final years in quietude and penance on a very, very generous pension provided by the king. And that is my talk about the Marquise de Montespan, the long-term mistress of Louis XIV, a great schemer of her day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cathie. And I think next we will have our Zoom debut author, who's Virginia Crowe. This is her first Zoom talk, so be kind to her. Virginia, you're up.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm afraid I haven't got a presentation to share. You're just going to have to look at me. Sorry about that, but here goes anyway. So the lady I'm talking about is Colonel Anne, who was a major player in the Jacobite Rising of 45. So that's a bit of a heads up about what I'm talking about there. Normally, when you hear about the Jacobites and you think about the women involved with the Jacobite Rising, everyone automatically thinks, oh yeah, Flora MacDonald. She's like the go-to person. And, you know, over the sea to sky, everything's super romantic and everything. But actually, there were a lot more women involved in the risings than just Flora MacDonald. And I intend to prove to you today, I hope anyway, that Colonel Anne was one such woman who was much more instrumental and a much stronger woman than that poor Flora MacDonald, who we automatically think of. Flora MacDonald was someone who did as she was told, and she did it well, but Colonel Anne was someone who told people what to do. And she was an absolute leader and a super strong woman, which hopefully you will agree with me about when we get to the end of the talk. She was born Anne Farquharson in 1723 to a pro-Jacobite family. So the Farquharsons were very pro-Jacobite. That might seem strange, given that we're still quite a long way off from the 45, but actually we're only 8 years after a Jacobite uprising. So the second Jacobite uprising was in 1715, and that would still have been very much in the minds of those who had supported the Jacobites. So she grew up as a Jacobite sympathizer. It was expected, it was what she knew. She was a very, very glamorous and beautiful lady. She had loads and loads of suitors, and amongst those were two in particular. One was Alexander MacGillivray, who would later go on to command her regiment, and the other was Angus Mackintosh, who she married. But like I say, there were many others apparently, but she ultimately chose Angus Mackintosh, who was almost 20 years her senior. She was totally devoted to Angus, and even to the point that in 1744, so just a year before Charles Edward Stuart arrived in Scotland, she went out and helped him gather enough men so that he could take control of one of 3 independent companies that had just become available. These were government posts. So she went out dressed up in men's attire so that she could ride around the country to gather 97 of the 100 men that he needed in order to get his position as the head of this company. That wasn't her only recruiting experience. So a year later, or 2 years later nearly, she set out recruiting once again, but this time it was because Charles Edward Stuart had arrived in Scotland, and she, unlike her husband, who was a government soldier, had decided she was going to come out in favour of the Jacobites. So this must have been quite an interesting thing to see at the time. Here you had a leader of a company who was fighting for the government, and against him, he was now being pitted against his wife, who was going out and collecting her own regiment from his lands. And she was very good at this. She managed to recruit everyone she approached about joining her regiment. And sources vary. Some people say it was as few as 200 men. Others claim it was as much as 600. So you can guess which side of the argument those people were on. Her regiment, like I say, was commanded by Alexander MacGillivray, because women were not allowed to command on the battlefield then, but they were still very much her regiment. And they went on to join the Prince at Falkirk, where they won a victory, and then ultimately at Culloden, where they lost and were defeated. But between times, we have the event that she is probably most famous for, which was the Rout of Moy. So Moy was her house. That was where she lived. It's a little place south of Inverness. I don't know if anyone's aware of it, but it's a much bigger place now. But at the time, it was just her house and the people who were part of her husband's lands. So we're going back in time to February 1746, and the Jacobites were returning north after making it as far as Derby, and they were heading towards Inverness. They'd set their sights on Inverness, and they decided to stay overnight at Moy House. Charles stayed overnight at Moy House with some of his close friends. While they were there, they were treated, as you would expect, very well. They had a lavish feast, everything was great. They all went to bed, and the next thing they knew, someone arrived at the house to tell them that there were 1,500 government troops who were almost on the doorstep. So Lord Loudon had marched out from Inverness, having heard that Charles was in the area, and decided that this was the best opportunity to catch him. There is rumours that everyone panicked, including Colonel Anne, but then she was the first one to get back on track and work out a plan. And what she did is really, it's one of those things that you read about in books and you think, no way, that's never going to happen. You know, no way would that happen in history. Come on, be serious. But she collected half a dozen men, and she said to them, right, here we go. We've got this whole regiment marching down from Inverness, head out and cut them off while the prince and his men get to safety at the other side of the lands. And that's exactly what they did. So there were like 6 people marched out, and they made so much noise, spread around the landscape, called out to imaginary regiments, shouted, fired guns from all directions. And the result was that the 1,500 government troops turned tail and fled back north to Inverness. And they didn't stop there. So they actually went across from Inverness and kept going north and north into the North Highlands. As a result of that, then Charles was able to just march straight into Inverness, and there were no casualties there. And there was actually interesting story, which is a bit of an aside, but I'll just mention this anyway. There was actually only one casualty in the whole of the rout of Moy, so only one person died, and that was MacCrimmons, who was the MacLeod piper. And he had actually foreseen his death, so he knew he would not be returning home when he marched out. How true that is, I don't know, but that's the legend. There is some dispute over where her title as colonel comes from. So it could just be as simple as the fact that she had managed to raise this regiment. It could also be as a result of her husband's approach to her. So he was caught, he was taken prisoner by Charles, and then sent into his parole in her care. So he was returned to Moy House, and she was responsible for him. And upon arriving at the house, she said to him, "Your servant, Captain," to which he replied, "Your servant, Colonel." And that could be where she got her name Colonel from, her rank Colonel from, but she was also apparently awarded it by the Jacobites for her bravery, her wit, and her allegiance. So one or two of those, one of them has to be the case. Later on, she would be taken prisoner and paroled into his care, and the cycle turned completely. But despite the fact that the rout of Moy was quite spectacular and probably also a little bit amusing, the part that I think is particularly her finest hour was actually later than this. So like I say, she was arrested and she was taken to Inverness, and she wasn't the only one. There were many, many other women who were also arrested. Amongst those was a Jacobite supporter called Anne Mackay, who had helped Robert Nairn, who was a leader in the Jacobite army, to escape from custody. She'd been tortured for days, and as a final act of torture, in the hope of finding out where Robert Nairn had been and where he'd fled to, they were going to whip her through the streets of Inverness. However, Colonel Anne stepped up and spoke out on her behalf and managed to stop that from happening. And as a result, the Mackay family stayed very loyal and very close to Colonel Anne for the rest of her life. Well, the 45 didn't end well for Colonel Anne. However, she did have the final laugh, because years later at a ball in London, she, along with her husband, met the Duke of Cumberland, who, as you may be aware of, was responsible for all the devastation and verging on genocide that happened across the Highlands after Culloden. And he wanted to dance with her, which is lovely, really. However, he wanted to dance with her to a pro-government tune. And she agreed, but only on the condition that following that, he would dance with her to a pro-Jacobite tune. And so that's what he had to do. Finally, she died in 1787. She outlasted her husband by many years, and she was buried in Leith in a very quiet churchyard there, hardly befitting of someone who had played such a major role in the 45. However, that was just going to be her end. There is now a commemorative plaque and a white rose, which is the Jacobite symbol that marks where she might be buried, but they can't be 100% sure. Things didn't always go her way. She was very much the victim of propaganda on both sides. In fact, when she was arrested, the government troops didn't believe they'd got the right person, because the image that they had been presented with was of virtually an ogre. And here was this very calm, very genteel lady being riding through into Inverness. And they just couldn't believe it was her. But there was propaganda on her own side too, which made her into something that she certainly wasn't, including untrue to her husband. However, she was very much in love with him. So I believe that she was a very strong woman, because I think that what makes someone strong, women and men alike, is not about taking up arms. It's not about being sure you're right the whole time or anything like that, but it is about knowing your own mind and not being afraid to act upon it. And that is exactly what Colonel Anne did. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Virginia. That was fantastic. Well done. Okay, next up, I think we have Paula Lofting. Turn your microphone on.
I knew you were going to say me for some reason. Hi, I'm Paula Lofting, and I'm a historical fiction novelist, and currently working on a non-fiction book about Harold Godwinson. Tonight I'm going to talk to you about Githa of Wessex. So I'd like to take you back to the mid-11th century to meet Githa. She was the Lady of Wessex and wife of Lord Godwin. He was the Earl of Wessex. She was born in Denmark about 995. Hers was an impeccable pedigree. She was possibly a cousin of Canute's, and her father, who was splendidly named Thorgils Sprackaleg, meaning strut or fast leg, was the nephew of King Sweyn Forkbeard. She was given to Godwin, who, after impressing the new King Canute with his loyalty and military prowess, as part of a package which included the territory of Wessex. They appear to have had a happy marriage and spawned 6 boys and 3 girls, one of whom, Edith, was to become the Queen, married to Edward the Confessor. One of her sons, Harold, became king in 1066 for a short while before dying at the Battle of Hastings in 1066 with his brothers Gurth and Leofwin. Githa could be said to have enjoyed a fruitful and positive life, experiencing the joys of watching her family grow in their fortunes and benefiting from her husband's increasing wealth and power. But it was in her later years that she was to see her perfect life unfold. Her eldest son, Sweyn, never really fitted into the family, and after his appointment as Earl of Hereford, hoping to impress the Danish community there, he went around claiming that he was not the son of Godwin, but in actual fact, the son of Canute. By this time, Canute was not alive to defend Githa's honour, but Githa put her foot down and declared an oath before a council of noblewomen that Sweyn was actually the son of Godwin. After this, he kidnapped the abbess Egifu of Leominster and asked the king if he could marry her. He was told under no uncertain terms that the answer was no, and that he had to put her back. But he refused, being a sport brat that he was, and kept her for a while and fathered a child with her, and then decided he'd had enough and sent her back to the abbey. As if that wasn't bad enough, if that wasn't enough to break Githa's heart, he was later to go on to murder his cousin Bjorn. And Bjorn was Githa's nephew and nephew of the King of Denmark. So it wasn't actually a very good move on Sweyn's part. He was actually declared nithing by the whole of the Huscarls at one of their meetings that they used to have, and exiled. But he eventually went to on pilgrimage and to atone for his bad behaviour, and died in the hills of Lycia of the cold. So it didn't really help that he'd left his shoes behind, but yeah, he ended up dying, but at least he'd repented. Later, Githa and her family were exiled, and having spent good 9 months in uncertainty in Flanders, Godwin and his sons successfully fought their way back to power. And she came back to England only to find that her youngest son, Wulfnoth, and her grandson, Hakon, had been sent to Normandy as hostages for William at his court. That's William of Normandy, the soon-to-be conqueror of England. To add to her difficulties, Godwin, her husband of quite a few years, died after their return, and Harold stepped into his earldom of Wessex. The rest of her sons would also become earls. In 1065, after some peace and familial stability, her eldest surviving sons, Harold and Tostig, were to fall out big time. Tostig, who was Earl of Northumbria, was ousted from his post and blamed his brother Harold. Tostig was to eventually invade in 1066 with Harold Hardrada, and fought a battle with Harold, Tostig's brother, at Stamford Bridge, in which Tostig and Harold Hardrada died. Eventually, Githa would lose the rest of her surviving sons, apart from Wulfnoth, at the Battle of Hastings, where William of Normandy was the victor. Githa was never to see Wulfnoth again, because he was kept as hostage until he died somewhere in 1080. Githa is a tragic figure of post-conquest years. Bereft of her sons, she put her faith in her grandsons, the sons of her beloved Harold. Godwin, Magnus and Edmund had made an unsuccessful attempt to invade from Ireland. And 2 years after Hastings, Githa was to come into the fore of events herself, getting involved in the rebellion to remove William from the throne. She supported the resistance from Exeter, and William lay siege to the burh, and the inhabitants struggled valiantly against his attempt to break the siege, including actually mining under the city. Githa was said to have roused the inhabitants of Exeter to fight back, encouraging them not to give in. She was in her early 70s by now, and was still managing to, to rouse the morale of the men inside the city. Unfortunately, townsmen had to give in, because they were at night they were hearing the hostages that they'd given to William. They were hearing them being tortured and having their eyes put out and things like that. So they thought, this has got to end. So unfortunately, Githa had to escape, which she did in a boat full of refugees, including her granddaughter Githa and her other daughter, Gunhild. Eventually they sailed to St. Omer in Flanders. The attempt to overthrow William caused her to lose her lands, and William made sure she would never come back by giving them to his Normans. Her grandsons made one more failed attempt at invading England, then returned to Ireland, never to be heard of again. Gunhild became a nun at St. Omer, and she died there later, in around 1080. Her granddaughter, who was the daughter of Harold, Githa took to Denmark, and she most likely lived long enough to see negotiations to, start to get her married to the Prince Vladimir II Monomakh of Kiev. Hers and Harold's bloodline would live on in Githa's children born of this marriage. I'm not really sure when she breathed her last breath, but it may have been around 1069 to 1070. She'd lived a long, successful life that ended in tragedy, but her courageous resistance at the end showed her to be a true Viking daughter, to whom the word surrender just didn't compute until the others gave up the battle for her.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Paula. I do like Githa. She's one of my favourites as well. So right, we have 2 speakers left. So up next, we're going to go across the pond to Samantha Wilcoxson.
All right, thanks, Sharon. I'm Samantha Wilcoxson, and my most recent book is Women of the American Revolution. It's nonfiction, and one of the chapters is about Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, and that's who I am going to talk about today. Eliza is who we mostly know her by. If everyone had their cameras on, I would ask how many people have seen Hamilton, the musical, because that's one of the reasons that people have actually heard of Eliza, at least since that came out, if they hadn't before. So as a child, she was actually known by Betsy, not by Eliza. And she was a daughter of General Philip Schuyler. He was a general in the American Revolution, and his wife, Catherine Van Rensselaer. And I don't know how many other Americans are here today, but those are big names in New York history. Schuyler and Van Rensselaer are. And Hamilton, until Alexander Hamilton, was absolutely not. He came from the West Indies. He was born on a tiny little island called Nevis, and it's down by St. Kitts. And so until he came to America, he was nobody when he arrived. He was an orphan. He was likely a bastard. There's some debate over whether his mother was ever married to his father, but needless to say, Eliza's status was a lot higher than Alexander's was. But Philip saw a lot of potential, as did many other people, in Alexander, and he gave them permission to get married near the end of the war in 1780. And Eliza was the only one of her sisters to not elope, so she was a good, obedient daughter, and got permission and had a traditional wedding. And so what most people know about Eliza is her relationship with Alexander. And he, of course, is a really big name. He's an exciting guy. He didn't keep many secrets, said lots of things he shouldn't say, and including writing the Reynolds pamphlet, where he admitted to having a torrid affair with Maria Reynolds, and which he did to defend his name, saying that he didn't have financial scandals he was involved in, that, the things that his enemies are trying to dig into were really related to this extramarital affair. And he thought it was better, I guess, to admit that than to have people think that as the Secretary of the Treasury that he was involved in financial scandals. He was killed in a duel with Vice President Aaron Burr in 1804. And at that point, if he had been involved in financial scandals, I hope he would have left his poor wife and 7 surviving children not in debt, but they were. And so one of the things about Eliza that I find interesting is that when Alexander died, people showed their affection for her and for him too, because it was a really tragic way for him to die. He was 49 years old, and some people thought, you know, still had potential to do a lot more. And at one point, people thought he might be one of our American presidents. But so to save their house, which was called Hamilton Grange, and it actually still exists in Upper Manhattan, you can go see it. It's a little yellow Federalist style house. It's not as big and magnificent as some of the other ones like Mount Vernon or Montpelier or some of the other founding fathers' homes, but it is there. And when Alexander died, they had built it just a few years previously, and he had left no way for it to be paid for. So a group of a couple dozen gentlemen put together this pact where they all donated different amounts of money and saved this house for Eliza and her 7 children that she had that were aged 2 to college at that time. So she really had her hands full when Alexander died. And she went on to live 50 years after he died. So there's really a lot more to her than the fact that she was married to Alexander Hamilton. And one of the things that she did was to start the first orphanage in New York City. And she started that with a group of other women. It was the New York Orphan Asylum Society, and it actually still exists today. It is the Graham Wyndham in Brooklyn. So that is one of the things that Eliza did, even though she's remembered, rightly so, as an obedient daughter and a submissive wife, and in some ways very much an 18th century wife. She did a lot to expand women's domestic sphere and become involved in activism that women previously, especially in America, hadn't really started doing yet. So she was very involved in this orphanage. And another thing she did was start a free school near Hamilton Grange for the children in that area who couldn't afford an education. They could at least go to this Hamilton free school that burned down shortly after her death. But before it burned down, lots of children were educated there. So one of the stories that I like most about Eliza is that in 1837, and this is when she was 79 years old, so not a young woman anymore, she decided to take this trek out to the Wisconsin territory. So at this time, it was 10 years before Wisconsin even became a state. And at that time, it was considered the far west, even though now Wisconsin's kind of in the middle, probably most people would say about America. And her son William had gone there, started a mining settlement that was called Hamilton's Diggings. And so Eliza took a steamboat out west when she was quite elderly at that time. And she thought this was a great adventure. She wrote letters back to her family that, you know, weren't on this trip with her. And you can tell that she just really enjoyed this adventure that many younger people would not have embarked on at that time. And Eliza stayed really active into her old age. On July 4th, 1848, which was the 72nd anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, she was 90 years old and present at the laying of the cornerstone for the Washington Monument. And she was there with Dolly Madison, who was also getting up there by that time. She had been the wife of James Madison, who was the 4th president of the United States. So together, the two of them had also started, well, Dolly had started and Eliza had helped once she lived in Washington with an orphanage in Washington too. So even though she's best remembered for being married to America's first fiery Secretary of the Treasury, Eliza did a lot on her own and is a really great example of women getting involved in their communities and expanding their domestic spheres outside of their own home.
Thank you, Samantha. That's brilliant. I actually love your Women of the American Revolution. There's so many of them that are just fascinating. And I didn't know much about that period, but that book, it enlightened me. It was brilliant. Thank you. So
Thank
last, but by no means least, we have Lynn Dawson with a really interesting contribution.
What name are we going to use? Yeah, I want to talk about a very little known woman called Margaret Ann Bulkley and a relatively well-known man at the time called Dr. James Barry, who were in fact one and the same person. Margaret Ann Bulkley is believed to have been born in about 1789 in Cork, to Mary Ann and Jeremiah Bulkley. The reason for the doubt about her birthday is that later on in life, when she rather changed her identity, she put a variety of birth dates on various different applications in order to disguise her age. More of that later. Her early childhood was very financially precarious because her father spent some time in debtors' prisons, and for a time, Mary Ann, her mother, and the daughter were reliant on rather reluctantly given help from Mary Ann's brother, James Barry, who was a celebrated Irish artist and professor of painting at London's Royal Academy. Barry died in 1806 and left some money, but it was clear that young Margaret was going to have to earn a living. And it seems that her education initially was headed towards becoming a governess or a teacher of some kind. However, Margaret came up with a new and somewhat irregular solution to the problem, which was carried out with the help of her mother, and some of her uncles were very liberal-minded artistic friends. In 1809, Mary Ann and her daughter boarded a Leith smack bound for Edinburgh, and by the time they arrived, they had been transformed into aunt and nephew. The young James Barry, as he was now known, enrolled at the medical school at the University of Edinburgh. And at the age of about 20, Margaret Ann Bulkley had answered to that name for the last time. She spent the rest of her long and very eventful life as a man. Barry began studies at the medical school as what they called a literary and medical student. And his short stature, unbroken voice, and fairly feminine-looking features led to suspicions that he'd actually lied about his age. Initially, the University Senate tried to block his application for his final examinations because they thought he was probably too young to take them. But the Earl of Buchan, who was a friend of his uncle, had been a friend of his uncle, intervened, and Barry qualified and then moved to London for further training. He finally qualified as a surgeon in 1813 and immediately applied to join the army, and took up posts, first of all, in Chelsea and Plymouth, being promoted to assistant surgeon, which was about the equivalent of an army lieutenant at the end of the year. In 1816, Barry was posted to Cape Town, and Buchan gave him a letter of introduction to the then governor, Lieutenant General Lord Charles Somerset. Fairly close to his arrival, Barry managed to save the life of Somerset's sick daughter and became the governor's personal physician and very close friend. In 1822, Somerset appointed Barry as colonial medical physician. It was a huge jump from his current rank, and not one you would normally have expected somebody of that rank to have. He was at the Cape for 10 years, and he made huge improvements to things like sanitation, water systems. He interfered with conditions for enslaved people, prisoners, the mentally ill. He built a sanctuary for people with leprosy. And he also performed one of the first known successful caesarean sections in which both mother and child survived. I was really astonished at that. I didn't know that had been done at that stage, but there we go. Barry wasn't university liked, however. He was blunt in his criticism of local officials who tried to block any of his reforms. And really only his friendship with the governor meant that he generally got away with it. On one occasion, he even fought a duel with another officer and proved the better shot, hitting his opponent's cap badge. After promotion to full surgeon in 1827, Barry was posted to Mauritius the following year, but he was soon in trouble again. He went absent without leave and returned to England to treat Lord Charles Somerset, who was back home by then, who had fallen very ill. Barry remained with Lord Charles until his death in 1831. Somehow he managed to avoid being kicked out of the army at that point. We don't really know how, but you can assume that some sort of influence was applied. Barry's next posting was to Jamaica and then on to St. Helena in 1836. On St. Helena, another argument with a fellow army surgeon resulted in him being arrested and court-martialed on the charge of conduct unbecoming of the character of an officer and gentleman. Barry was found not guilty and honourably acquitted. Future postings and further promotions took him to the Leeward Islands, the Windward Islands, to Malta, where he had to deal with the cholera epidemic and did so remarkably well, to Corfu, and then on to Canada for his final promotion to Inspector General of Hospitals, which was equivalent to the rank of Brigadier General. Once again, he fought for better food, sanitation, and proper medical care for soldiers and their families. Barry was consistently furious at unnecessary suffering and tended to take a very high-handed approach with both local and army authorities who tried to stand in the way of his improvements. Famously, during the Crimean War, he got into a huge argument with Florence Nightingale and gave her a public telling off, which she never forgave him for. He was arrested and demoted several times during his career for losing his temper and tanking over all objections, but he always got away with it eventually. He was seen as a bit of an eccentric, kept most people at a distance, although he adored animals and had a beloved pet poodle. He was also very close to his black servant, John, whom he employed in South Africa at his first posting there, and who stayed with him until he died. I rather suspect that there is something else happened to the screen there, but I'm not going to worry about it. Sorry, I got distracted there. I suspect John probably knew his secret, and I think that that was one of the reasons he was able to maintain his secret for his entire life. He needed to have somebody really who was on board, and John stayed with him until, as I say, until he died. Barry was retired from the army in 1859 at the age of 70 because of ill health. I say was retired because he fought it tooth and nail, and in the end he made a huge fuss about it, but he wasn't a well man and they absolutely insisted that he go. He eventually lived a quiet retirement until his death in 1865, and it was then that his secret was finally revealed, initially by the char lady who came to lay out the body, and then by the physicians when they were called in. It made the newspapers. It was quite a big scandal at the time, and the army was very unhappy about it. There is a rumour, but I'm not sure it's ever been proved, that they deliberately sealed his army records for a much longer period of time than would normally have been so that there could be no further speculation. But as I say, that is speculation. I've not actually discovered anyone who knows that for sure. Since Barry's death, historians have speculated and argued a lot about his motives, his sexuality, his gender identity. And a lot of these ideas seem to me to change over the years, reflecting modern societal norms rather than the known history. Margaret Ann Bulkley's real motives lie buried in a tomb in Kensal Green Cemetery, and the rest is just guesswork. Other than his servant John, the one close relationship that James or Margaret sustained seemed to be with Lord Charles Somerset. Their closeness at the time led to rumours. An anonymous accusation claimed that the writer had detected Lord Charles buggering Dr. Barry. It led to an investigation because homosexuality, of course, was very much illegal at the time. Once again, all this is speculation, and the investigation proved nothing. But Margaret Ann Bulkley, who spent her entire life in disguise to reach the top of her chosen profession, risked everything at that time to go to Somerset when he was dying in London. As a novelist, I know how I'd write that.
I want to go to London.
Yeah.
That was brilliant. Thank you, Lynn. I think she's fantastic to actually spend your life as a man just so that you can do the job you really want to do. Right, if everybody, you are welcome to put your cameras on now and microphones. If anyone has any questions, then wave at me or put your hand up in the reactions. Nobody? Okay. Anybody got any women they'd like to talk about celebrating women in history? Let me put the gallery on. Come on, somebody. Otherwise, I'll have to talk again.
Oh.
Hello.
Hello.
So I'm actually a guide at Kensal Green Cemetery.
Ah.
And because James Barry is one of the people we talk about.
Indeed.
I was very interested in hearing your take on him, her. You know, I mean, I think your point about the the attitudes, the interpretation of his life, following contemporary fashion, contemporary debate, it is very true. It's extraordinary, whatever one believes. And yes, I don't think there's enough evidence to be sure either way or anyway.
Yeah.
But a fascinating character.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few theories out there. I've heard some people say that they thought she may have been asexual, or, you know, various different theories. But actually, in the end, we don't know. There is nothing to suggest anything other than she wanted a different life and she wanted to do something different.
Yeah.
And it was the only way she could do it.
Yeah.
Indeed, yeah. But kept up the male persona absolutely consistently from age 18.
Yeah.
There's, you know, people putting on interpretation on that. But yeah, honestly, we cannot be sure.
Yeah.
But absolutely extraordinary, though.
I think you're right, John, as well, and we have to be careful not to put, like Lynn said, our modern take on it, because that wasn't relevant in those days. They didn't have that attitude, so we have to be careful not to apply modern attitudes to something that happened over 150 years ago. She did what she had to do in order to do her profession, and that's all we can take from that. We can't assume other things.
No.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, but fascinating. And you know, we have people who know enough to ask where he is buried. So you know, quite well known.
Yeah.
Fine. So in fact, the headstone it was replaced some years ago. The original one has been lost. So one even wonders whether the original location was, but heaven knows.
Yeah, you can't tell. But it's nice that there's still a memorial there.
But yeah, absolutely.
She was very impressive.
Absolutely.
Because it was an impressive career in the Army Medical Service for anybody.
Yes.
Indeed.
Yeah. You know,
and the improvements that Barry brought about were just extraordinary, and the very modern ideas, really. And something else I read was an insistence on medicines being properly tested and licensed. We got an example of a crack medicine seller who was he was in court for manslaughter 3 times.
Yeah, that's right.
So that the same sort of period.
Yeah, very modern thinking, actually, in terms of things like cleanliness at a time when it really wasn't, you know, when she first qualified, or he was first qualified, he was a forward thinker.
Yeah.
And the first successful cesarean, I didn't know about that. That was news to me.
Yeah. I did read in one place the qualification, the first successful cesarean by a European.
Yeah,
now, I don't know what's behind that.
I also read that. It said what it actually says is one of the first successful cesareans, and I think that probably is it. I think that the techniques were being used actually elsewhere. But
I've got a short message I'd like to read to you. It's important that
Sorry about that. Looks like we had a bit of interference. So yeah, that's interesting, because usually cesareans were performed on women who were dead or had no hope of survival. It was the last resort.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which is funny when you think how everyday it is nowadays.
Do we know, Lynn, how other people might have reacted when they found out the truth that she was actually, or he was actually a woman?
It was a mixture of reactions, actually. I mean, there were some people who claimed they'd known all along, but most of the army colleagues said that they had no idea. He had this reputation for being very bombastic, very aggressive. I mean, Florence Nightingale was apparently completely stunned by it. There's a letter from her somewhere, and I don't have it in front of me, but she sort of quotes that actually she must have been a completely low and terrible creature, you know, this sort of woman. Florence liked things to be done just so.
Obviously.
Her reputation, she wasn't one of the early feminists out there, Florence. And I think she was almost more angry to discover that she'd been like ripped to shreds in a public place because she'd done something wrong by another woman, thinking it was a man and a doctor, and she had to behave herself and behave respectfully towards him. And of course, actually, it was in fact somebody else. But I think I often wonder, and this is pure speculation on my part, because you know how my brain works, whether or not that aggressive attitude and forcefulness was deliberate.
It's like a front.
Yeah, you know, it kept people at bay. It was like, oh, look at that very aggressive little man there, rather than thinking, you know. But I mean, he must have been very good at it.
Yeah, that thing about the attitude being a cover is certainly the way one of our guides tells it. So yeah, it sounds possible.
Yeah, it's a guess, but that would make some sense.
Yeah, but it takes a great deal to keep that up consistently.
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely determination. I think it's important to see it in the context as well, because as a woman, you just did not have the chance to do anything remotely like that. And if she went out to do this, to improve the world, to improve conditions for patients, the sanitary conditions and all that, she must have had these ideas already, and then she kept learning on the job, I guess. So she had no choice but to keep it up, and whatever the rest may or may not be, as you say, we don't know. I think that is very impressive to be a woman in a man's world, really, and that was kind of the question in my essay as well. How do you make it as a woman in a world run by men, for men, where a woman's place is, you know, the bedroom, get some kids, and that's it, and then you can retire knitting or stitching or whatever.
When you look at Nicola de la Haye, it's all about, you know, she acted manfully. She didn't do, she did it not thinking of anything womanly. And John Barry actually avoided that kind of judgment by acting as a man. It's like suddenly you haven't got that female judgment where everybody's looking down at you just because you're a woman and you're doing a man's job.
I was wondering, Lynn, because you mentioned that he didn't, they said no because they thought he was too young. And you said that was it a relative of his?
It was a friend of his uncle's. His uncle had died by then, but the Earl of Buchan, Lord Buchan, was a friend of his uncle's. I wondered the same thing, actually. I wonder
if he knew.
He knew. Certainly some of his uncle's friends did know, because they had to help, you know, and the additional fees. Some of his uncle friends were definitely involved in the thing. So there was obviously a small group of people at the beginning who knew, who helped them, you know, on their way. And obviously later on, and I mean, one of them, there is a thing where any letters addressed to Margaret, as she would have been, were to be forwarded to her mother, who was now apparently her aunt. There is actually a letter that it's sort of like, you know, the address and name has been changed on it and is sent on to her mother. So if there was anything going on that she wanted to know about previously, her mother could then pass on the letter to her. So it was quite well planned. There was a lot of discussion involved.
So there was a lot of people quite colluding, you know, almost like a collusion amongst. But so I wonder what it was about her or him going into that profession, why everyone sort of pulled out the stops to get him there.
We don't know. I mean, the people involved were definitely a bunch of what we would consider to be liberals, very forward thinkers. I mean, one of them was actually a sort of Spanish guy in exile, who was a friend of her uncle's, you know, one of the sort of Spanish liberals who was in exile at that time because of what was going on in Spain. So they were forward thinkers, and I almost wonder if it was almost like a gesture of some kind. An experiment, a gesture. To say this, she really wants to do this. She was obviously phenomenally bright. You know,
she was also well connected, wasn't she? I mean, you're talking about the Earl of Buchan supporting her, Somerset supporting her. These were powerful people.
Exactly. You know, it was yeah, and I mean that once again there was speculation. Did Somerset know from the beginning when she was going out there, because she arrived with this letter of introduction? Certainly there was, I suspect there was some kind of affair there. I mean, it's a bit of a coincidence that, you know, somebody reckoned they'd seen something going on, and obviously they but the fact that she, you know, she really worked hard at this career. She went all over the world where she was posted. But that one time she effectively went absent without leave and stayed there with him until he died. There was something close there. There was something very close there. So I mean, he certainly knew at some point, but whether or not he knew from the start, he might well have done. He might well have done.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, she was an extraordinary doctor.
And the success speaks for itself. So those who were in the know then would support her, stroke him, because they saw the results, they saw the positive results. And why would you stop something like that if it's for the benefit of all? It's amazing. Incredible story.
Yeah.
So what gets me though is that she never revealed herself, because I think even after I've been forced to retire from the army, I'd have to go,
right away.
You made me a general.
Yeah, you wouldn't though if you had a good pension, would you?
Yeah.
The research.
Well, I think that's it for this evening then. Thank you very much everyone for joining us and celebrating women in history. I hope you found something interesting out of our 6 women.
Thank you very much.
If you want to know more about Nicola de la Haye, I will be talking about her on Thursday night for Heritage Lincolnshire in an online talk, and there are still tickets available. Quick plug. I'm also on radio, BBC Radio Lincolnshire on Tuesday, talking about Nicola de la Haye in advance of my book coming out in May. Has anybody else got any events coming up?
Not at the moment.
No. Okay, we didn't talk last week, isn't it, Samantha? Because you had one yesterday.
Yeah.
We will have another Zoom talk soon, so just watch out for me advertising that. We haven't decided what we're talking about next, so because I'm finishing off a book. As soon as I've finished that, I can think about something else. So thanks very much for joining us this evening. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. I'll just introduce the authors again, just in case you want to look up their books. So it's been myself, Sharon Bennett Connolly, Virginia Crowe, Paula Lofting, Lynn Dawson, who writes as Lynn Bryant, Cathie Dunn, and Samantha Wilcoxson. Thanks very much for joining us, and have a good evening.